Okay, now we're going to get into some of the more diverse areas of the ocean, the continental shelf, and we'll also talk about coral reefs. But starting with the shelf. So the shelf then is part of the subtidal zone, which starts after, below the lowest tide and is always submerged. It is, in actuality, the submerged part of the continental plate right before you get to the shelf break. Varies considerably in depth and slope. Okay, the examples we gave before were the active and passive margins. Average depth is about 490 feet, and the average width is about 48 miles, but it can be as small as 0.6 miles, so active margins are generally much smaller. It is also the richest part of the ocean, and a UN resolution established that the 200 miles of coast of water before your land is now monitored by each country, which was good because this allows more control in these areas and more protection. So the continental shelf is where we do most of our fisheries, most of our catch, but it's also very important because this is where many species go to lay their eggs, where their larvae and juveniles will grow until they reach full maturity. So biodiversity is very high because it has a lot of the limiting factors and an increased amount. So you have lots of light, you have substrate, you have you're close to the air, so there should be lots of carbon dioxide and oxygen. There is also lots of nutrients and generally currents to keep these nutrients flowing through them. The species of the ocean that you would commonly think of are all found there, including sponges, cnidarians, worms, mollusks, fish, and echinoderms. Alright, so some of the characteristics. There is some turbulence, like I talked about before. You have waves crashing in from the sea. This causes the mixing of temperatures, so you have warm and cool waters, mixing of salinities and nutrients. This allows for lots of nutrients to be available, but also reduces the clarity of the water, so it may decrease the ability of some photosynthetic organisms to photosynthesize. However, the cycling of nutrients and the constant bringing off of nutrients from the benthos allows lots of nutrients to be available, so you have a diverse habitat for organisms to establish there, including worms, clams, lobsters, mud shrimp, and fish. And a lot of them burrow into the sediment. And this diverse array of consumers then leads to the next level as well. So you have lots of predators which are attracted to the area and are also sustained by the diversity of life there. So these organisms, of course, are primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers on the food pyramid. Alright, so there's 4 different types of communities. We'll look at soft bottom, benthic, which is the most common community, seagrass beds, kelp forests, and hard bottom benthic. Okay, so let's see, did I miss something? Yes. So our soft bottom benthic has a very active fauna, including the ones we mentioned before, the infauna, epifauna, and meiofauna. But also you have those organisms living in the sea column itself, which are the neritic pelagic waters, right? There aren't very many sessile types, those that are attached to the substrate, because there isn't a lot of substrate to attach to because it's sandy, right, and it shifts. The resource abundance is also very patchy. Okay, so you find groups of organisms kind of patched together in areas as those nutrients become available, as opposed to being regularly spaced or randomly spaced. In soft bottom benthos, you have adults and larvae which are living together. Many of them are attracted to each other because of pheromones, and many of the infauna will also build tubes within the soft bottom. Okay, this allows them to be protected from predators. It also allows them to create an environment where they can access the oxygen and nutrients from the water without being fully immersed in the sediments. The meiofauna are very abundant and are also very diverse in this area because you have the particle size of the substrate is big enough to where lots of little organisms can live within it, and it's diverse enough to where you have a diversity of habitats and lots of different organisms can specialize in different areas. So you have lots of little species which are interacting in ways we talked about with ecology. There are lots of endemic species which are only found in that specific area, not in other areas. We talked about this before, but we have two different types of feeders. Deposit feeders, which rely on just the sinking of nutrients from dead and decaying or leftover organic materials, and as it sinks, it catches those deposits and uses those for its nutrients. Suspension feeders, on the other hand, are in areas where they will actually filter the nutrients. So they have sometimes like a pump where they pump water in and then pump water out. And this is generally needed in more turbulent waters, which is usually found in sand. So they can't just rely on things dropping down there because it's too turbulent. They have to like pump it in and pump it out. Bioterminators are also very important to the ecosystem, and these are organisms which will go and mix up these areas which are otherwise undisturbed, and this will allow for nutrient mixing and oxygen and carbon dioxide, so that these resources are then available for others. So bioterminators are an example of a keystone species that can make nutrients available and increase the diversity of the area. Some of them include large whales, which will feed off the bottom or scrub their barnacles off that grow on their faces. Or you have skates and rays and other large organisms which shake up the benthos. Alright, seagrass beds are found in sheltered shallow waters with good water quality, which is kind of hard to find. So generally these are away from estuaries where you have an increase in sediment from freshwater rivers. There are up to 50 different types of seagrasses, but we have some that are dominant. They have a low tolerance for changes in temperature, water clarity, and nutrient availability, so the conditions have to be just right. In cool waters, the dominant species are Zostera or eelgrass. In tropical waters, the dominant grass is the Thalassia. They, in combination with algal species, are the primary producers, are very thick in biomass, and then provide a great substrate for lots of other organisms to live within there. Alright, hard bottom subtidal. This is less common, so this is going to be found on active margins, but as we talked about before, the active continental shelf is not very wide, so there isn't very much of this ecosystem. It's found in submerged rocky shorelines or on sessile slopes in areas where oyster reefs have established or worm tubes have established. So here's a worm tube here. Or calcareous algae, something that creates a hard substrate on a soft substrate. This provides great hiding places and diverse habitat, kind of like the meiofauna, for lots of organisms to live there. The kelp community is also a very diverse area, which is generally dependent on brown algae in cold waters, which are nutrient rich. So cold water holds more oxygen, and if there's upwelling there, it holds more nutrients as well. They are very fast growing, grow up to 20 inches a day, and they create these basically underwater forests, and it can extend all the way to the sea surface. Laminaria are a smaller kind. Macrocystis is a large kind that will grow again to the sea surface. The main predator is sea urchins, and sea urchins' main predators are sea stars and otters, so they are very important to the dynamics of the kelp community. These kelp have three main pieces: the holdfast, which ties it to the substrate, the stipe, which is like the stalk, and then the blade, which is like the leaf, but they aren't plants, they are algae. The kelp community has these predators, like we said before, which are very important to maintaining or reducing the herbivores which are going to eat the seaweeds and the kelp. There's also filter feeders, and they're going to feed off the plankton and other things floating in the water, sinking down to the substrate. There is a cascade effect, which is currently been described, which we'll talk about in a minute. But if you remove sea urchins or you remove sea otters or killer whales, you can create a dynamic which has trophic cascades effects. Alright, so here is some of the kelp forests where they're found. We have some along the Pacific coast of the United States and some in the northeastern part of Canada. But generally not really in eastern United States. Alright, kelp again brings a diversity to a diverse habitat where lots of things can live, provides food for lots of organisms, and shelter. So the kelp forest is a very abundant and diverse ecosystem. Alright, so like I said before, otters are kind of a keystone species in maintaining the ecosystem dynamics. Recently, killer whales have started to eat more sea otters. They originally fed off of fish and seals and sea lions, but those have decreased in number, and so killer whales are starting to eat more sea otters. Well, when the sea otters start to disappear, these sea urchins are left with lots of kelp to eat, and so they will start to eat all the kelp and not have anything to keep their populations in check. So this is really messing up the dynamics. This then leads to other problems as well. So if there isn't enough kelp, then you aren't going to have enough fish in the kelp beds. And then predatory birds will have to eat more other prey sources such as seabirds, so then seabirds will decrease in number with the fish and all the other things. So it's a good idea to help the fish and seal and sea lion populations rebound so these killer whales can switch back. Alright, coral reefs, another very abundant, very diverse ecosystem found in the marine life. They're very dependent on coral. So what is a coral? Coral is a cnidarian, so a species similar to a jellyfish, only rather than having a free-floating life form, they have a sessile life form. They have stinging cells, stinging tentacles called nematocysts, and those are for capturing prey or for defending them against predators. The polyp then is the sessile form, and it secretes a calcium carbonate structure around itself, creates this cavity which it then lives inside of. So as it sets down more and more of this calcium carbonate substrate, it will continue to grow outward, and also as it does so, it'll make more of these little polyps. So colony is made up of one polyp that then cloned itself through budding, and now you have tons of these polyps creating a larger structure. They share a digestive and nervous system, so they share nutrients and are able to communicate between each other. There are different types of corals based on what they do physically in the ecosystem. So you have hermatypic corals, which build the reef. they add more structure to it and start building layers on top of each other. They contain protists or organisms called zooxanthellae, and they depend on warm and clear water. Ahermatypic corals do not add more structure or do not more layers to the reef, and many of them do not have zooxanthellae, and they are also not as restricted by water temperature and water quality. And we'll explain why that in a minute. Why it's that way in a minute. There we go. All right, so some of these you could classify as hermatypic or ahermatypic. So these large corals, which you can see grow to a larger and larger size, these are hermatypic. Here's a bunch of hermatypic ones growing on top of each other. And then ahermatypic are these more branching kinds. All right, so coral get their energy in a number of different ways. One is through zooxanthellae, which are dinoflagellates, which live inside the polyps of the coral. You see these little orange spots here, and it's what makes them green. These are photosynthetic organisms, and they photosynthesize and they provide energy molecules for them. The coral, on the other hand, provide carbon dioxide and nutrients for the zooxanthellae. And this, of course, is a mutualistic interaction. They can also secrete mucus, and that mucus will cause things to stick to it, and the debris or organisms that stick to it, they can then ingest. They can also use their nematocysts to catch zooplankton, but some of them rely exclusively on their zooxanthellae. Some of them can rely exclusively on their zooplankton feeding. And then they also externally digest some organisms, so they will secrete enzymes which breaks down organisms, and then they'll absorb that into their bodies. Right? Reproduction, they can reproduce and create these sexually create these planulae larvae, okay, which are little larvae which will then go and attach to the substrate and grow into a polyp form. Once they then establish, they will start asexually reproducing and create large colonies through budding. Now, coral reefs have a specific range of temperatures in which they grow, 68 to 86, so these are generally warm waters. They have to have light for the zooxanthellae to be able to photosynthesize. And so shallow, clear waters where you have a substrate are going to be the areas where you find them. The salinity has to be pretty constant, 35 parts per thousand. Can't have a lot of wave action, or that will not make them able to establish and receive the sediments and receive the nutrients that they need to grow. They can't have a lot of sediments because that will decrease the water quality, and pollution affects them a lot too. So you aren't going to find coral reefs in these northern latitudes where it's too cold, or near rivers where you have too much sediment, or where the currents are really strong, or really, really close to the shore where the waves crash into the shore. Bleaching is a phenomenon that occurs when the corals are highly stressed. So there's a lot of different things that can cause it. High temperatures, poor water quality, increased sediment. What happens is the zooxanthellae are expelled from the coral for a time. If it happens for too long, the coral will die. Sometimes they are able to reestablish their zooxanthellae when the stress has reduced. But this has occurred more and more extensively with global warming and ocean acidification. And ocean acidification is caused by an increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which then dissolves into the ocean, which then reacts with the water to create a more acidic environment. Alright, so here are the different types of coral growth forms. So we have some branching, we have a massive growth here, a free living one, which doesn't need open substrate to establish. You have encrusting forms, plate-like forms, foliaceous, which are leaf-like, and columnar forms. Okay, so here are some. This is a massive one over here. Here's some branching, another branching, a plate-like one over here, and here you have kind of a diversity of branching, encrusting, and columnar types. There are other things that help form the reef, including coralline algae, soft corals such as sea whips and sea fans, hydrozoans, which are anemones, and sponges, which help cement the coral rubble that kind of falls off of coral as they die or as the pieces break off, and they can tie those together into a substrate. All right, now the types of coral reefs. There are 3 different types. The fringing reefs, this is the most common. Basically, it's just a fringe around a landmass in the narrow continental shelf, which forms a coral reef. They form along the flat part, the reef flat, and then you have some which also forms among the reef slope. At a certain point, it'll become too deep and they can't form past that. So these are generally close to the land masses. Barrier reefs are interesting. So these are close to the shore, but some of them can be very, very far away from the shore. And so you have a back reef slope, a reef flat, crest, and a fore-reef slope. The back reef slope is less pronounced, so this is where you have sediments from wave action, which and it's going towards the shore, so you're not going to have a very steep slope on the back reef. Sometimes it doesn't go all the way to the shore because the wave action there is too strong and it's not going to allow the establishment of the coral. The reef crest and flat, this is going to be the highest area of production. This is where you have the flow of nutrients. You're still close to the sunlight, so you have the least limiting factors at this area, so you have the highest diversity and growth. And then the fore-reef slope is very steep as it goes into the deep sea benthos. All right, one of the largest reefs is the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. It's the largest structure in the world, made of a combination of many different barrier reefs. It's about 1,200 miles long, and width varies from 10 to 200 miles along the coast of northeastern Australia. All right, atolls then are the third type, and they are a circular reef structure which forms when a volcanic island wears away due to erosion, and basically what's left is the surrounding reef, which formed from the fringing and then barrier reef. But now that the island has completely worn away, you just have the reef that is left there. They have a reef flat, which is generally where the volcano or island used to be, an inner reef slope, which is more gradual, and then you have an outer reef slope towards the outside of where the island was. There's also a lagoon, which is usually less than 200 feet deep, and the 2 largest are in the Maldives in the Indian Ocean and the Marshall Islands in the Pacific. All right, so a little bit about the coral reef ecology. The water column is very low in nutrients, okay? And that's because, again, it's in warm water, right? So there isn't a lot of nutrients that it can hold, and also it has to be very low in turbulence. So not a lot of nutrients can go in there. So what makes the energy available are the zooxanthellae and the coral mutualism. Okay, so that mutualism allows for all these nutrients to be made available. There are also some cyanobacteria which are going to fix nitrogen and make those available for organisms as well. Other nutrients will make their way by occurrence, but they can't be too strong or the coral reef can't establish. Food web in the coral reef is very diverse. Again, this is the most diverse ecosystem in the marine environment. It being diverse, you are going to have a lot of predators which are going to visit the reef and try and eat lots of organisms. So there has to be defense mechanisms in the organisms there, so they can produce chemicals. There are also other sessile organisms where they can't run away, they can't, produce fast swimming techniques or anything to avoid predators. Instead, they will have things within them to make them unpalatable. So spicules, which are made of calcium carbonate, are found in sponges. Sclerolites are found in soft corals, which are made of silica. And then some coralline algae forms in very, very hard structures, which is hard to eat, which is an encrusting form. There's a lot of competition on the reef for space, right? So you have lots of different species there, but they all need to establish different areas. So you can see them sometimes competing and inhibiting each other. Some of them just establish very quickly. Some will grow up and outright so they can establish greater in the water column. Some will grow very slowly but will be able to outcompete all other organisms. So those you have these organisms which get very big. Some corals will sting each other. They also have to compete with other organisms such as algae and seagrasses and invertebrates. So it's very dynamic, lots of competition occurring. Alright, and then there's lots of organisms which feed directly on the coral, have adaptations able to do that. So things like parrotfishes, which have very hard teeth, almost beak-like, which can break off coral to eat it. Yeah, and then a diversity of other organisms which are able to eat it as well. So some bacteria will eat the mucus, crabs will eat the mucus, sea urchins will eat the coral themselves. The wrasse will eat the eggs and the larvae as they sexually reproduce. So lots of different things depending on the coral for not only food but structure and habitat, and that's why it's so diverse.